want you to walk back in time with me and imagine we are deckhands on a Mississippi steamboat in the 1860s. April 1865. The Mississippi air was thick, not just with humidity, but with the thousands of Union soldiers crammed onto the Sultana. As a deckhand, I'd seen our steamer full, but this was different. They were fresh from Confederate prisons, eager for home, their hope palpable. I was in the engine room, feeling the boiler's familiar thrum, and when it hit, not a shudder, but a sudden deafening roar, a blinding flash, scalding steam, and debris tore through the deck above. The sound was a metallic shriek, followed by the screams. The ship lurched violently. I scrambled out, choking on smoke, eyes stinging. The ship was tearing apart, her wooden hull no match for the blast. Orange flames raced across the decks where men had just been singing. Panic erupted. Soldiers, many too weak to swim, leapt or were thrown into the frigid water. Screams for help, for God, for mothers were everywhere. Men disappeared into the churning water, swallowed by debris and flames. The Mississippi, usually so gentle, became a hungry monster that night. I grabbed a floating crate, my lungs burning, muscles screaming from the cold water. The strong current pulled us downstream, away from the burning wreck. Looking back, the Sultana was a fiery inferno, a jagged, burning skeleton against the now orange sky. The noise faded, replaced by the chilling cries of survivors in the water. We drifted, numb and shivering, watching our world burn as we drifted away. The sun rose later, painting the sky with bright colors that felt so at odds with the darkness below. Welcome to Talk with History. I'm your host, Scott, here with my wife and historian, Jenn.
Hello.
On this podcast, we give you insights to our history-inspired bold travels, YouTube channel journey, and examine history through deeper conversations with the curious, the explorers, and the history lovers out there. Now, before we jump in, I do want to say thank you to a couple folks who've left us some 5-star reviews. Thank you to the folks who are leaving us top reviews. So on Spotify and on Apple Podcasts, if you haven't and you're listening and you enjoy these podcasts, please leave us those starred reviews. You don't even have to write anything. You just drop us 5 stars and that's it. If you do want to write us something, we will read that on the next show when we record that show. So thank you those who've been doing that, and we encourage you guys to leave us some more of those because we do have to try and catch the History Channel. Yeah. We're working on it. We're only a few million followers and audience members behind.
Yeah.
So,
but dream big or don't dream at all.
That's right. All right, Jenn. So the Sultana disaster, this is something that a lot of people, especially here in America, right, may have heard of, but I would say most folks don't know about. But this is the largest American maritime disaster ever, period.
Yeah, I would say most people don't know about it. I would say when I bring up the Sultana with most people, it's really history buffs who might know it, but your average everyday person have no idea. Where the average everyday person knows the Titanic, or they know about the USS Arizona, but they do not know about the Sultana. And so, yes, this is the greatest maritime disaster in American history. Happened during the Civil War. And most people don't know about it because it was overshadowed by another major historical event.
Yep.
And that historical event is probably something everybody knows about as well. So it's understandable why people don't know about this. But it's sad because these victims have been forgotten then because of that. And because they're like literally forgotten, because the most unknown Civil War soldiers, the second most is in Memphis, Tennessee. And it's because of this disaster. And so it's one of those things that it could benefit from more research. It could benefit from people digging in and learning more about these men. But unfortunately, it's just so unknown that it just needs more awareness to the average everyday person and history in general.
Now, when you say it happened during the Civil War, I think it technically happened like right after the Civil War was technically over. Like literally the war had just ended.
Yes.
And I know we're going to get into the details. The war had just ended. A couple thousand prisoners-ish are released from prisons down south and are getting brought back north. So tell us the surrounding events around this.
Yeah. So like you said, it happens in April 1865. So it's this big month of history, right? So yes, the surrender happens in April of 1865. Lincoln is assassinated.
Yep.
April 1865.
Yeah, Appomattox was like April 9th or something
April
like that.
April 9th.
Yeah.
Then Lincoln. Then this happens April 27th, 1865. So it's like this whole month is filled with these big historic events. And the first two are so huge, it overshadows this third one. But yes, technically you're right, Scott. It's I would say Civil War time frame, but not during this. It's the aftermath of the Civil War. So like you talked about, the Sultana was a sidewheel steamboat on the Mississippi River. And when we talk about the Mississippi River, it really is like the main highway of the country at the time. The railroads are really starting to find themselves being very important during this time, but the Mississippi has held its importance before the Civil War, after the Civil War. And because that is so important, when Vicksburg falls, it really is like the end of the Civil War, because now the Union controls the Mississippi, and that is this vital vein through the entire America.
Yeah. And actually, when I had originally written my intro with this kind of story there, I had written it that the characters, us, were actually kind of didn't know what side they were on. They just knew that business was busy because the Mississippi was important, whether you're in the South, whether you're in the North. And most likely, I would guess, a lot of these steamboats were probably operating with it. Now, I wouldn't say with impunity, because it sounds like they don't care what side they're on, but I would imagine they were busy regardless of who was controlling what port.
So commerce, right? It's so important to trade. And so it's vital to the North and the South. It's vital to the economics of the North and the South. That's why when the North finally controls it, they can control how much supplies are getting to the South. And so they're not letting that happen. And the North is taking all the supplies. So the people who are operating on the Mississippi, yes, they're still holding allegiances to one side or the other, but they're still, overall, their motivation is the dollar, money. And so much so the Sultana is known as the fastest ship on the Mississippi. And we talk about in the video why that is. It just has made the fastest voyage from Cairo to New Orleans. And that's how they measured that. And so it gets to have the antlers between its two smokestacks. And that is a symbol for everybody on the Mississippi, that if you want to trade your goods or get your goods to the major ports, New Orleans, this ship will get it there the fastest.
And it was really neat because, and we'll talk about the museum that we went to in Marion, Arkansas, that is the Sultana Disaster Museum. That's actually getting a new location, new improved location. One of the docents there, she taught us about the antlers, which we thought was really neat. And I believe like they even would race. And I don't know if they were like actually sitting side by side racing, but they were just like, who can make the fastest trip up and down? And then they would get these antlers, because if you didn't know that fact, you'd be like, why are there these random antlers strung between the smokestacks? So they're actually strung between the smokestacks. And if you look, and for those watching the video, I'll put up a picture of the Sultana. You can actually see a pair of antlers strung between the two smokestacks of the Sultana, indicating that they had won the recent fastest time or whatever that was, right? They're the Millennium Falcon of it.
Yeah. So it's a side wheel steamboat. And like I talked to before on the video, so steamboats come in like 3 different variations. You got the paddle wheel in the back, which is a lot what people think of when they think of paddle wheels or wheel-driven ships on the Mississippi. But a side wheel, the Sultana has a side wheel on each side of the ship, and it's not as big as a stern wheel would be, split the side. But the neat thing about a side wheel is one wheel can move forward, one wheel can move in reverse, and it can really maneuver the ship a lot more easily to get it close to the sides of the riverbank, which is what the Mississippi is doing, because it's pulling into these ports right on the side. And so it can really get close in to get loaded on and off. And so the versatility of how you can maneuver that ship made a side wheel so much more advantageous for Mississippi travel. And then you have an internal wheel. So those are the 3 different kinds. You have a stern wheel, you have side wheels, internal wheel. Internal wheel is inside the ship. You don't really see it from the outside. That one is not as used as much because it's dangerous. If you ever have traveled on the Mississippi, I have extensively. You get a lot of trees that will wash off and float down the Mississippi. If it's pulled into a internal wheel, it really does damage inside the ship. And so they really didn't use those as much. But those are the three types of wheeled boats, ships you would see along the Mississippi. But Sultana's a side wheel. Now, it's built in 1863. So it's not a very old ship when you think about this. Yeah. And it's really intended for this lower Mississippi trade. So it really has made its name doing a regular route between St. Louis and New Orleans. And it has a crew capacity of 376. Remember that, because this is going to be its downfall. Now, it's first launched in January of 1863. And like I said, it's about 260 feet long. It's 42 feet wide and 2 side-mounted paddle wheels driven by 4 fire tube boilers. So those boilers make a difference too. So think 2 boiler per wheel per side. And when we talk about the boilers, they're 18 feet long and they contain 24 5-inch flutes that kind of like hold the water and boil it. And that's where you're getting the steam, and that's how you're driving these ships. So think about how this is all working together, because this is all going to be the downfall of this ship. So what happens, these events, like you said, the Civil War, the surrender happens April 9th. The Sultana finds itself in St. Louis on April 15th, right after the president's been assassinated.
That's right.
And the captain, and we have Captain James Cass Mason, is just informed of the assassination of the president. So he runs out and gets as many newspapers as he can to get the information down to New Orleans, because he knows he's the fastest ship on the Mississippi. They drape the ship in mourning cloth, which they buy lots of black cloth, and they drape the ship in mourning cloth because that's also like a symbol and a message they can send as they go down the Mississippi. Think a lot of people still aren't literate at this time. That's why the antlers are such a symbol for everyone to understand what that means. Draping a ship in mourning cloth is also a great symbol for the nation to see along this massive highway of America that our president has been assassinated.
That's how they got the news out. That's also part of the reason after Lincoln was assassinated that I think probably a small part of the reason why they took the long train route to get him back to Illinois, where he was eventually interred, was to let the nation see and get the news that way, to believe that this is something that actually happened.
Sure, because there's no television and the people want to mourn as a nation. And so the train route is so significant. And so is this Mississippi water route. So Captain Mason does his job, I would say, as a leader on the Mississippi. He is taking the news from St. Louis down to New Orleans. He leaves St. Louis April 13th, 1865, bound for New Orleans. On the morning of April 15th, he's tied up in Cairo when the word reaches that Lincoln has been shot. So it's the 15th when he hears the information in Cairo, even though he leaves from St. Louis on the 13th. And that's when he gets an armload of the newspapers from Cairo and heads south to spread the news. Now, he hits Vicksburg first. And in Vicksburg, he talks to a Captain Reuben Hatch, the chief quartermaster at Vicksburg, with a proposal. So they know Union prisoners of war are going to be released. People are going to be pardoned. They're coming from Cahaba, that is a Confederate prisoner of war camp in Selma, and they're coming from Andersonville. That's a very famous Confederate prisoner of war camp in Atlanta, Georgia. And they know that those paroled soldiers are going to be hitting Vicksburg, and they're going to want to be going back home, back north. And the U.S. government would pay $2.75 per enlisted man and $8 per officer. So they come to an understanding. Knowing Mason needs money, Hatch suggested that he could give him a load of about 1,000 prisoners. Now, bear in mind, it's going to be loaded with almost double of that.
Yeah. And they're only supposed to have like 360-ish.
Yes. And only if Mason would agree to give Hatch a kickback. So he agrees to Hatch's offer. He's like, yes, let's do this. And then he leaves Vicksburg, heading down to New Orleans. So they have this plan in place, right? Because Hatch knows the prisoners are going to be coming to Vicksburg. He'll hold them there. He'll wait until the Sultana makes its way back up north after hitting New Orleans with all the news. And then they have this plan already worked out. So they don't even have to talk about it when they come back. So this is already understood before they even load on the prisoners and before they even hit Vicksburg to get the prisoners. So it's an understood agreement.
Yeah, I don't think I realized that it had been that set up by the players, the ship's captain and some other folks.
Yes. So they leave Vicksburg. They're down in New Orleans. They disperse all the newspapers. They disperse the news. And they leave New Orleans on April 21st. And they have about 70 cabin and deck passengers and some livestock. So there's about 70 paying passengers on board too. So again, legal capacity 376, 85 crew, 70 paid passengers. And so they have about 150 people as they hit Vicksburg to get loaded up.
Wow.
So, but what happens is about 10 hours south of Vicksburg, before they even hit Vicksburg, one of their 4 boilers springs a leak.
Oh.
So they already have a boiler issue before they even get to Vicksburg.
So that's before later on when things start getting out of whack as far as balance because there's too many people.
Yes. Okay. So think of these boilers are already handicapped. So it's when they get to Vicksburg that they get a boiler repair, and it's just like a quick fix. It's not a new boiler to replace everything. They're taking, and a boiler is under a mass amount of pressure and heat, and they're just repairing this boiler, which they're going to put a lot of stress on this boiler. So this is the whole issue by why this happens. It wasn't like they had 4 great working boilers as they're leaving Vicksburg. They have 3 great working boilers and 1 that's severely incapacitated.
Well, and if you think about it, in we call this a Sultana disaster, right? And we know from the intro that one of the boilers, if not a couple, explode. But they're if you think about just total load that the boilers are designed to handle, which is less than 400 people, and they end up with what, like over 2,000 on board?
Yeah, at the end of the day, when everyone's loaded on board, it's 2127.
So they're putting like 700% more than stress and effort and all the stuff on these boilers. So that's interesting about the leak and like the repair.
Yeah. So when you think about 4 boilers and they're supposed to have 376 people, each boiler handles less than 100 people. When they load on 2,127, each boiler is going to handle over 500 people. Right? So like you said, they're taxing these boilers way outside their capacity. Plus you have one that's just been repaired. So this is where the whole issue starts. So they reach Vicksburg on the 23rd and they start to load people on. And like I said, they had just gotten all those released prisoners from those 2 Confederate prisoner of war camps, and they load on. They believe that they're loading on less than 1,500. In actuality, they load on 1,950 paroled prisoners. So like they had made the deal for 1,000, right? They double that because they're just not paying attention. They're not checking. And then 22 guards from the 58th Ohio Volunteer. You got the 70 paying passengers from New Orleans, and you have the 85 crew members. That's a total of 2,127. When it can only hold 376, that's 1,800 people over the capacity of the ship. And I show you this picture that they take on April 26th. So they leave the night of April 24th. They make their way up the Mississippi. And on April 26th, they stop in Helena, Arkansas, where a photographer took a picture of the overcrowded vessel. And I show that on the video.
That's like the famous one. They have it like all blown up. So if you go to the Sultana Disaster Museum in Marion, Arkansas, which is only like 20 minutes from Memphis.
Oh yeah.
It's just across the bridge. It might be 15 minutes. So if you're in the Memphis area, definitely go visit. But they have it blown up. And what they point out is what you're going to talk about is like how the smokestacks look different. And that's indicated by all the people being on one side of the ship for this picture.
Yeah. So everyone comes over to the land side because the photographer is setting up there to take this photograph. Well, you have 1,800 people over capacity all going to one side of a ship. And if you know anything about ships like Scott and I do, balance is everything. And so it's going to list.
And these riverborne ships and boats and stuff like that, they don't have a deep draft. So it's the center of gravity, which is what's really important on a ship, is much higher for these boats that are on the river. And so when you have all of these, and I'll show the picture for those watching the video, when you have all these men going to one side of the ship, that center of gravity is going to start rocking the ship over towards where the picture is on the land side.
Yeah. And like Scott said, a riverboat's not going to have a high draft because it's shallower. The Mississippi gets very shallow in certain places, especially close in towards land, towards different ports. And so it can't have a high draft. So center of gravity is higher. The more decks you put on a steamship, the higher it gets. And when you bring people over, it starts to list, so much so that the captain was worried it was going to flip.
Yeah, capsize.
And so you can tell in the picture, I show you one smokestack is letting off smoke and the other is letting off nothing. That lets you know that the boilers are unbalanced. There's water in one and there's not water in another. And so you're not having anything to burn, essentially. So no steam is coming out. And it's so evident in the picture. You can also see the listing. You can see where it's leaning into the water more. And they just get the picture as quick as they can, and they get the men to move over to the other side. Now, the ship is also like bowing in certain areas, and bowing is like the floors are bending down. And so they're taking wooden planks and pushing up the floors of the second deck, third deck, fourth deck to hold the people up. So they know they have more people than they should have.
They should have dumped like half of them at Memphis.
I know. So this happens on the 26th. This photograph is taken, and Scott will show the photograph. You can even still see the antlers in the picture of the photograph. It's super cool to see. And that's taken in Helena, Arkansas. And then they're going to arrive in Memphis at 7 p.m. on the 26th. And they're going to unload 120 tons of sugar, which is going to help. And then 200 men get off. So those men really do help. And then she's just going to go a short distance up the river and take on some coal about 1 a.m. And then it's 2 a.m. on April 27th, 1865, about 7 miles north of Memphis, the boilers suddenly explode. It kills people instantly, and then everyone else goes into the water.
Yeah, and one of the things, and I know a smidge about steam stuff because my first ship in the Navy was still a steam ship, right? The Navy has used steam works well. Steam power works very, very well. And so the Navy still has some steamships out there. And my first was the Tarawa, where you and I met, and that was a steamship. Now, I was not an engineer on that ship, so I didn't learn as much as others. But one of the things that you're looking for is balance across the boilers. You don't want to put a sudden drastic change on one boiler because think about it. All of a sudden you put a bunch of water in there. If there's all these men that are making the ship rock back and forth and making things out of balance, well, if one boiler is taking a heavy load, the other one is getting super hot, but it's not burning anything. And then all of a sudden, if the water shifts over, that's going to cause a sudden amount of water, heat, and steam that will all of a sudden expand. Think about heat, right? Heat expands, and that can cause an already weakened or already recently fixed, quote unquote, boiler to potentially explode. And that is most likely what happened with this because things were so out of balance. They were so heavy. The boilers just couldn't handle the load. They were so overstressed. And that is most likely one of the things that caused the explosion.
And so you have people who die instantly, but you have all of these weakened prisoners of war going into the water, and all the wood is catching on fire.
Yeah, and you got to think about it too. It's April, and the Mississippi will still get pretty cold.
Yes.
So it's still spring, and so it's not like they're falling into this warm, lukewarm water where they can just float to shore. I mean, I don't know if it's not icy. It probably feels like that to these men who were already very, very sickly. If you've ever seen pictures of prisoners of war that left, was it Cahaba and what was the other one? Andersonville. I mean, they are emaciated beyond belief. It's disturbing, some of the pictures that are out there. So men like that falling into the water just literally don't have the strength to try and fight and swim their way to shore.
Yeah, they were so weakened. They ran out of strength. They would cling to each other, but whole groups went down together.
Yep.
And so the Sultana is burning, and they realized, people in the area start to realize that this is happening about 2:30, about half hour after the explosion. Boats go out to try to rescue the survivors. So at the same time, dozens of people have floated downriver, and they're beginning to float past Memphis. They're calling for help. And so you have ships going into the water to save people. But in the end, the casualties are about 1,200. So 1,200 people will die. And then you're going to have, it was like 2,100, 1,200 dies.
And I want to say like there's like another couple hundred that actually die like after they get out of the river, because the total initial reported deaths for this was around 1,600.
Yeah.
So I think there's like 1,200 that they never probably never identified or just went down. And then there's more that even died after they even got to shore. Again, think about it. All these men that are just sick can barely walk and move, let alone try to swim out of an icy cold river. And so that 1,600 number is what puts it above the Titanic and above the USS Arizona. And then I think the 1,200, if I remember correctly, is what actually the book author, and we'll mention him here in just a little bit, that we met at the museum, mentioned died kind of that night going down with the ship.
Yes. And so like Scott said, about this 1,200 who went down with the ship, almost all of them were unidentified.
Yep.
Because they would strip themselves of their clothes because they're wearing these wool uniforms and it's pulling on water, and they strip themselves of their clothes and then they just don't have the strength to swim and they're freezing. And so when their bodies are found, there's nothing to identify them.
Yeah.
And even if they did have their uniforms on them, very few put tags and things. So a lot of the men who were identified, or like Scott said, they survived the initial explosion. They survived being pulled out of the water, yet they died subsequently in Memphis or other places later, but they were able to give their name. And so that's how a lot of the men who are identified, which is a small percentage, were identified. We have a few men who washed ashore, and Ely is one of them. And that's the person we talk about with the author.
Yeah, Lieutenant John Ely.
From the Ohio. He had a personal diary on him. And his personal diary is what kind of gives you some insight to the life of a soldier, a life of a prisoner of war, and they identified him by his name and who he was. And so other soldiers sometimes had name tags of their uniforms sewn into their uniforms. That was another way. But again, Ely was pulled out of the water like a week later. So you can imagine the body is very hard to identify a week after it's been in the water for so long. So those other distinguishing factors like a diary or a tag would be what they used at the Civil War. There's no dog tags at this time. There was no dog tags during the Civil War. So they don't have anything like that.
Now, this happened on the evening of April 26th, 1865.
So it's the early morning of the 27th,
early
2 a.m.
Early morning of the 27th. And then later that day or the next day, what kind of world famous event happened that overshadowed what would have made headlines here?
So John Wilkes Booth is killed. He's caught and he's killed.
He's shot and he
on the Garrett
dies
farm.
On the Garrett farm. And so that headline makes
April 26th.
April 26th.
So the day before.
So it actually happened the day before. So when the news finally got out, he was already the headline of the news, and that dominated everything. And so this kind of got buried well below the death of John Wilkes Booth.
Yeah, because we talked about John Wilkes Booth before, and the manhunt, to the 2-week manhunt that's going on to catch him. It's not quite 2 weeks, but
there's a huge reward out on.
And so they caught him, they killed him, and now they're doing like the autopsy and everything surrounding how they caught him.
The trial.
That's getting all the headlines. So the Sultana gets so buried, and because all of these men were, again, unidentified. Their families didn't even know if they had survived. Their families didn't even know to look for them. So it was one of those things that it just gets so lost in history that's why Memphis has the second most unidentified Civil War graves of any other place in the United States because of the Sultana. And these men still haven't been identified. These families never knew what happened to their sons. And they thought maybe they died in battle. They had no idea they were on the Sultana, no idea they were making it home, no idea they almost got home. And Ely is a great example of that because he even writes in his diary, will next Christmas find me at home with my friends and family, right? And no, like all of these men who survived a prisoner of war camp couldn't survive sailing up the Mississippi.
Now, obviously, for those who listen to the podcast regularly, know that we like to go and visit these historic locations. That's typically the primary driver for what we do here. And so basically everything that we cover on the show outside of interviews and movies and stuff like that, we've gone to a location, that historic location. So you can't really go to where the Sultana sank because the Mississippi has shifted its course over the years, but you can go to the Sultana Disaster Museum. Again, as we mentioned earlier, in Marion, Arkansas, and they're actually just got a bunch of money donated to them. They're moving to a much better, much nicer location. And I think it as like Sean Astin, the actor.
Yeah.
So I think he was either involved or helped donate some money or something like that.
Yeah. So he's big involved in the charity for the museum. So
think Rudy. Think Lord of the Rings.
He loves the story. He loves the history.
He likes the story of it. So he was in Stranger Things.
Yeah.
For our younger audience, he was the not the stepdad, but like the boyfriend.
Yeah.
Who like sacrificed himself in season 1 or 2. Spoiler alert. But so he actually, I think, helped invest or has been helping this Sultana Disaster Museum. And I think we're going to try to go to their new opening in April of 26. March, April of 26 is what they said.
Yeah, I think it might be. They had pushed it back. It was supposed to be September, October 25, but they pushed it back to 26. But just so you know, the museum opened in 2015. And it's because in 1982, they found remnants of the Sultana in a soybean farm. So I always stress this on the Mississippi. Mississippi has changed course and has changed course significantly since the Civil War. So much so that the area where the Sultana sank is now all land and a farm, a soybean farm. So in this soybean farm, they found burned wood remnants, and they found the boilers. They found remnants of the boilers.
They found some of the boilers.
And they dug it up. And so the museum opened in 2015, and it's a great little museum, but it can't house all of these bigger artifacts that they've found. They have a really great depiction of the ship, like a model, so you can really see what the Sultana looked like. They tell great stories. They have lists of men that perished. They have a lot of artifacts from those men, including an alligator that was on board.
It's one of those things, like, I think it deserves the new location that it's moving to, because they have so many artifacts there, and there were some survivors and there were people identified. So they have pictures of people who are on the Sultana because they did identify some who made it out. But it deserves this new location because right now it's in a pretty small little building tucked around. But when we went there were still people coming and visiting. We met people, 2 gals that were driving up to Michigan, stuff like that. And there's a fair amount of people that are still seeking this spot out.
Yeah, and it's going to be in a new state-of-the-art permanent museum. They took the old gymnasium of the Marion High School and they renovated it into the museum. So it's going to have a great space.
And again, it's only like maybe 15 minutes from Memphis. So if you want to drive that iconic Memphis Bridge, right? If you're visiting the Memphis area and you want to drive across the Mississippi, you can drive across that iconic Memphis Bridge and go and visit Marion, Arkansas. This is a great little spot to go do an afternoon visit.
Absolutely. And if you want to learn more about the greatest maritime disaster in American history, this is waiting for you. There's a lot of historical markers to the Sultana. There's one in Memphis, of course. There's one in Vicksburg. We saw the one in Vicksburg. There's one in Ohio because a lot of the men were from the 115th Ohio. There's one in Knoxville. There's one in Michigan. So just honoring the men that a lot of these regiments represented. But in the aftermath, there was a lot of lack of accountability. They tried. So you have to realize the captain of the Sultana died. He was last seen helping people to get off the ship. He was last seen trying to save as many survivors as he could. So he could never be held accountable because he's killed in the disaster. When you talk about Hatch, who worked up the scheme, to avoid a court-martial, he quits the military as quick as possible. He quits service, avoids court-martial, and goes into hiding. They tried to make a Captain Frederick Speed. He was a Union officer who sent the 1,900 paroled visitors to Vicksburg. And they tried to charge him. And then the Judge Advocate General overturned it because Speed was at the parole camp all day. He was not personally involved. He was just sending the prisoners out saying, here, go on the ship, go on the ship. And then they have a Captain George Augustus Williams. He had placed men on board and was an Army officer, but the military refused to go after one of their own. So he was never held accountable either. And then you got Captain Mason of the Sultana. Like I said, he ultimately dies. So in the end, no one was ever held responsible for this greatest, deadliest maritime disaster in United States history. And I think that also goes in line because there was no public outcry to hold someone responsible because the public really didn't know about it. And so it's the end of the Civil War. People who have no idea that their family members are even in a Confederate prisoner of war camp just figured that they had died, had no idea to even fight for justice for their family member. So that's what makes this all the more sad. And then as a historian and people who love to tell history, their story was lost to history. And so that's what we find so important to have to get out and tell this story because it's so fascinating. It's so interesting. It's how this perfect storm comes together to create the greatest disaster that no one knows about.
Yeah.
And so we just want you guys to know about it, find out more, visit the museum. And if you have any questions for us and you want to know more about this, please leave a comment or something like that. Let us know if you knew about this and what we can do today to honor the men of the Sultana and their lives and what they gave to this country.
The Sultana disaster is still the largest maritime disaster in American history that almost no one knows about. No one but you. You know that in April of 1865, this steamboat left New Orleans and traveled north, picking up thousands of soldiers hoping to get home after the end of the war. You also know that not long after the Sultana left Memphis, the rocking of the ship overloaded the boilers, causing them to explode, sinking one of the fastest steamboats on the river and claiming more lives than the Titanic. And our history lovers out there now have that dinner time trivia question if the Civil War era topic ever comes up. Why isn't the Sultana disaster better known? It was overshadowed by the news of the death of John Wilkes Booth. News that swept the globe and buried the Sultana disaster in the murky depths of the Mississippi. If you want to experience this history firsthand and see artifacts from the Sultana, get to the Memphis area, drive that iconic Memphis Bridge across the Mississippi, and stop by the new and improved Sultana Disaster Museum in Marion, Arkansas. We'll talk to you next time.
Thank you.
This has been a Walk with History production. Talk with History is created and hosted by me, Scott Benny. Episode researched by Jennifer Benny. Check out the show notes for links and references mentioned in this episode. Talk with History is supported by our fans at thehistoryroadtrip.com. Our eternal thanks go out to those providing funding to help keep us going. Thank you to Doug McLiverty, Larry Myers, Patrick Benny, Gail Cooper, Christy Coates, and Calvin Gifford. Make sure you hit that follow button in that podcast player, and we'll talk to you next time.